My name is Daniel Harris, and I live in a quiet little town called Silver Creek. It's one of those places where everyone knows everyone, and nothing exciting ever happens, at least, that's what I used to think. I live at 22 Willow Lane, a modest house tucked away at the edge of town, near the woods. I've been living here for about 5 years, enjoying the peace and solitude that comes with small-town life. But recently, something has changed, and that change has driven me to the brink of madness. It started about a month ago, on a typical Friday night. I was home alone as usual, unwinding after a long week at work. I work as a graphic designer, so most of my time is spent in front of a computer, staring at screens and pixelated images. That night, I decided to take a break from technology and relax with a book. I was deep into a mystery novel when I first heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from somewhere in the house. At first I dismissed it as the house settling, or maybe a branch tapping against the window. But as the night went on, the tapping grew louder and more persistent. It seemed to be coming from the walls, moving from one side of the house to the other. I put down my book and listened carefully, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but it was impossible. The tapping seemed to echo through the entire house. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just my imagination, but the noise was relentless. It followed me from room to room, growing louder and more insistent with each passing hour. By midnight, I was on edge, my nerves frayed by the incessant sound. I checked every corner of the house, even venturing into the attic and basement, but found nothing out of the ordinary. Exhausted and frustrated, I decided to go to bed, hoping that sleep would bring some relief. But as soon as I turned off the lights and crawled under the covers, the tapping started again, louder than before. It was as if something, or someone, was trying to get my attention. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be causing the noise. The next morning, I woke up groggy and disoriented, having barely slept a wink. The tapping had finally stopped sometime in the early hours, but the silence that followed was almost worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that there was something in my house that didn't belong. I spent the day trying to distract myself, but the memory of the previous night's events lingered in the back of my mind. That night, the tapping returned, more intense than ever. It was as if whatever was making the noise was growing bolder, more desperate to be noticed. I tried to block it out, but it was impossible. The sound was everywhere, surrounding me, closing in on me. I felt like I was losing my mind, trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't escape. I began to dread the nights, knowing that the tapping would return as soon as the sun went down. I tried to stay awake, to outlast whatever was haunting me, but the lack of sleep was taking its toll. I started seeing things, shadows moving in the corners of my vision, fleeting glimpses of figures standing just out of reach. I knew they weren't real, just tricks of the light, but they terrified me all the same. One night, I finally snapped. The tapping had become unbearable, a constant drumming that echoed through my skull. I grabbed a hammer from the garage and started tearing into the walls, desperate to find the source of the noise. I tore through drywall and insulation, ripping apart my house in a frenzy, but found nothing. The walls were empty, devoid of anything that could be causing the noise, but the tapping continued, now louder than ever. It felt like it was coming from inside my head, a maddening rhythm that I couldn't escape. I screamed in frustration, collapsing to the floor in exhaustion. I don't remember much of what happened after that, just a blur of noise and darkness. I woke up the next morning to find my house in shambles, the walls torn apart and debris scattered everywhere. But the tapping had finally stopped. The silence was deafening, a relief so profound that I almost wept. I spent the day cleaning up, trying to put my house back together, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the silence, waiting for the tapping to return. But it never did. Instead, I heard something else, a faint whispering, just at the edge of hearing. It was so quiet that I could barely make out the words, but I knew they were there, taunting me, driving me further into madness. I don't know how much longer I can take this. The whispering has become a constant presence, a never-ending stream of words that I can't understand but can't ignore. I feel like I'm being watched, like something is lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. I've tried everything, moving to a different room, sleeping with the lights on, even leaving the house altogether. But nothing works. The whispering follows me wherever I go, a constant reminder that I am not alone. I've started to fear the night, knowing that when the sun goes down, the whispers will begin again. I don't know what to do anymore. I've thought about leaving Silver Creek, abandoning my house and starting over somewhere else. But I can't bring myself to do it. This is my home, and I refuse to let whatever is haunting me drive me away. But I'm running out of options. The whispers are getting louder, more insistent, and I fear that soon they will be all I can hear. I don't know what they want from me, but I know that I can't give in. I have to find a way to stop this, to silence the voices once and for all. If anyone is reading this, please know that I am not crazy. Something is in this house, something that doesn't belong. I don't know what it is or where it came from, but it's real. And it's coming for me. I've lived in apartment 6B of the Wilcox building for 3 years. It's a nondescript 6-story structure in a fairly decent part of town. Nothing fancy, just a place to call home while I save up for something better. My name is Mark Benson, 2008, working as a graphic designer in downtown Portland. Life was ordinary, perhaps a bit lonely, but peaceful. At least until the incident that made me question everything about this place. The Wilcox building isn't the kind of place where people know each other well. We exchange nods in the hallway, and a few polite words in the elevator, but that's about it. I wouldn't recognize most of my neighbors if I saw them outside. That's why it took me a while to notice that something was off in apartment 6A, directly across from mine. 6A had always been occupied by a reclusive man in his mid-30s. I didn't know his name, just that he kept to himself. I'd see him occasionally when I left for work, a brief glimpse of a tall, thin figure slipping into his apartment, always dressed in dark clothing. He never made eye contact, and I never thought much of it. We were all strangers here after all. It was sometime in late November when I first noticed the strange sounds. I was sitting in my living room, working on a project, when I heard a faint, rhythmic thumping coming from across the hall. It wasn't loud, just persistent, like someone tapping their fingers against a wooden surface. I tried to ignore it, figuring it was just my neighbor doing something mundane like hammering a nail or adjusting furniture. But the sound didn't stop. It went on for hours, until late into the night, and then started up again the next evening. It was starting to get on my nerves, so I decided to investigate. Maybe he didn't realize how thin the walls were, or maybe he was oblivious to the noise he was making. Either way, I figured a polite knock on his door would solve the problem. I stepped out into the dimly lit hallway, crossing the short distance to 6A. I raised my hand to knock, but before I could, the door creaked open a few inches. I hadn't even touched it. My first instinct was to apologize and leave, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hello?" I called softly, peering into the darkened apartment. There was no response, just the oppressive silence of an empty room. The rhythmic thumping had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness. I pushed the door open a bit further and took a cautious step inside. The air was thick with the smell of stale cigarette smoke and something else, something metallic and unpleasant that made me want to gag. The apartment was a mirror image of mine, but it looked neglected, like no one had lived there for years. Dust covered every surface, and the furniture was sparse and old as if it had been forgotten. "Hello?" I repeated, louder this time, hoping to draw out the tenant. But there was no answer, just the faint hum of the refrigerator in the tiny kitchen. That's when I noticed the door to the bedroom at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, and the thumping sound had started up again, louder now, more insistent. Against my better judgment, I walked toward it, each step echoing in the otherwise silent apartment. As I approached the door, a cold draft wafted through the hallway, sending a chill down my spine. The smell of metal grew stronger, mingling with the scent of decay. My stomach churned, but I couldn't turn back now. I had to see what was causing that noise. I pushed the door open with trembling fingers, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The single window was covered with a thick layer of grime, barely allowing any light to seep in. The bed was unmade, sheets crumpled and stained with dark spots that made me recoil. But it wasn't the bed that held my attention. it was the figure standing at the far end of the room. It was my neighbor, the man from 6A. He was facing the wall, his back to me, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His arm was raised and he was banging something against the wall, the source of the rhythmic thumping that had been driving me insane. I wanted to say something and ask him what he was doing, but my voice caught in my throat. There was something deeply wrong about the way he stood there, something that froze me in place. It was as if he was in a trance, completely oblivious to my presence. Then, as if sensing my thoughts, he stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, he turned to face me. His eyes were hollow, vacant, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. But what unnerved me was his mouth. His lips were pulled back into a wide, unnatural grin that didn't reach his eyes. Before I could react, he lunged at me, moving with a speed and ferocity I hadn't anticipated. I stumbled backward, slamming into the doorframe, my hands scrabbling for something to defend myself with. But he stopped just short of touching me, his face inches from mine, that horrific grin still plastered across his face. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his voice raspy and barely audible. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The stench of metal and decay was overwhelming, making my head spin. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead. Then, just as suddenly as he had attacked, he stepped back, his expression returning to that empty, lifeless stare. He turned away from me, and resumed his rhythmic thumping against the wall, as if nothing had happened. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted from the room, practically throwing myself out of the apartment and slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that I fumbled with my keys, dropping them twice before I could unlock my door. Once inside, I locked every bolt, pushed a chair against the door, and grabbed the heaviest object I could find, a baseball bat I kept for protection. I sat there for hours, gripping the bat, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for him to come after me. But he never did. The noise from 6A stopped, and the building was plunged into an uneasy silence. The next day I called the building manager and reported what had happened. He seemed surprised, claiming that 6A had been vacant for months and that the tenant had moved out after some personal issues. When I asked about those issues, he became evasive, telling me it was none of my business and that the apartment had been empty since the summer. I didn't know what to believe, but I couldn't stay in the building any longer. I packed my things that same day and moved in with a friend across town, leaving the Wilcox building and its strange tenant behind. But even now, months later, I can't shake the memory of that night. Sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I can still hear that rhythmic thumping, echoing in my mind, a reminder of the horrors that can hide behind the most ordinary of doors. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other's business, and nothing much ever happened. It was the kind of place where the most exciting event of the year was the county fair, but there was one part of town that people didn't talk about much, a stretch of dense woods on the outskirts known simply as the Pines. As kids, we were warned not to go in there, but like all curious kids, we didn't listen. The story goes that the Pines had been cursed for generations. Some said it was haunted by the spirits of the Native Americans who had been driven off their land. Others claimed it was home to creatures not of this world. Whatever the truth was, the place had an undeniable eerie vibe. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches creating a canopy so thick that even on the brightest day, it was dim beneath their cover. It was a late October evening when I found myself walking through those woods. My friend Jake had dared me to go in after school. We were both 16, and dares like that were still a test of bravery. I'd told myself I didn't believe in the stories, that I wasn't scared, but as soon as I stepped into the Pines, a sense of unease settled over me. The air was cooler in there, almost as if the place had its climate, and everything seemed unnatural still. I tried to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of my neck as I made my way deeper into the woods. The path was overgrown, the ground uneven with roots that seemed to deliberately try to trip me. I kept going though, determined to prove I wasn't afraid. After what felt like hours of walking, I found myself in a small clearing. In the center was an old abandoned cabin, its wooden walls gray with age and covered in moss. I'd never heard anyone mention a cabin in the pines, and its sudden appearance filled me with dread. But at the same time, I felt drawn to it, like something inside was calling me. I hesitated for a moment before walking up to the cabin. The door was slightly ajar, creaking open with a gentle push. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the faint light from the setting sun barely penetrated the grimy windows. The place was empty, just a single room with an old fireplace, a rotting table, and a chair that looked like it hadn't been sat in for decades. As I stood there, taking in the sight, I noticed something carved into the wooden wall above the fireplace. It was a symbol, one I didn't recognize, a circle with strange lines and shapes etched into it. Beneath the symbol were the words "He watches" scratched into the wood. I stepped back, a chill running through me. The air in the cabin seemed to grow colder, and a sudden sense of being watched crept over me. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was no one there. The woods outside were silent, almost unnaturally so, and the growing darkness made the trees look like shadowy figures lurking just beyond the cabin. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the stories about the pines were getting to me, but the feeling didn't go away. I needed to leave. The thought of staying in that cabin as night fell filled me with a sense of dread I couldn't ignore. I stepped outside, and that's when I saw him. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a man, or at least, the shape of a man. He was tall and thin, his face obscured by the shadows, but I could see his eyes. They were glowing, a dull, sickly yellow that sent a wave of terror through me. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just watched me. The air around me seemed to thicken, and every instinct screamed at me to run. But my legs felt like they were made of lead. I forced myself to move, to turn away from the man and head back down the path I'd come from. I didn't dare look back. The woods seemed to close in around me as I ran, the trees twisting and contorting as if they were trying to trap me. The path was barely visible in the fading light, and I stumbled over roots and rocks, but I didn't stop. The only thing that mattered was getting out of those woods. Eventually, I burst through the tree line, back into the open fields near the edge of town. I was gasping for breath, my clothes torn and dirty, but I didn't care. I was out of the pines, away from that cabin and the man with the yellow eyes. I looked back only once and saw nothing but the dark mass of trees swaying in the breeze. I made it home, but I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. What could I say? That I'd been scared by a shadow in the woods? That I'd imagined a man watching me? Jake teased me about the dirt on my clothes and the scratches on my face, but I just laughed it off, saying I'd tripped and fallen. But the truth was, I knew what I saw. And I knew that whatever was in those woods wasn't just a figment of my imagination. The nightmares started that night. I would dream of the cabin, of the man standing in the clearing, his yellow eyes burning into me. In the dreams I was always trapped, unable to move as he slowly approached, his face still hidden in shadow. I stopped going near the pines after that. Even walking past the edge of the woods sent a shiver down my spine. But the dreams didn't stop, and neither did the feeling that I was being watched. Now and then, I would catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a tall figure, standing just at the edge of my vision, disappearing when I turned to look. Years have passed since that night, and I've moved away from that small town. But the memory of those woods, of the cabin and the man with the yellow eyes, still haunts me. Sometimes late at night, I feel that familiar chill, as if someone is standing just outside my window, watching. I don't know who or what he was, but I know one thing for certain: the pines aren't just cursed, they're a doorway to something else, something ancient and evil. And once you've seen it, it never lets you go. So if you ever find yourself near those woods, heed my warning. Stay away. Don't go in. Don't let curiosity get the best of you. Because there are things in this world that are better left unseen, and once they see you, they'll never stop watching. I never should have taken the shortcut through Silent Hill. My friends and I were on our way back from a weekend camping trip when we decided to take the lesser-known route to save time. It was one of those decisions you regret the moment you make it. We were tired and eager to get home, and the idea of cutting an hour off our drive seemed too good to pass up. None of us knew much about Silent Hill, just that it was a small, nearly abandoned town nestled in the mountains, with a reputation for being odd. The road leading into Silent Hill was narrow, winding through dense, mist-covered woods that seemed to grow darker with every passing mile. The trees were thick and gnarled, their branches intertwining above us to form a natural tunnel. It felt like we were driving into the mouth of some great beast, swallowed by the darkness that seemed to pulse with life. I was the one driving, and my grip on the steering wheel tightened as the fog grew thicker. The headlights barely cut through it, and I had to slow down to a crawl just to stay on the road. My friends Jenna, Mark, and Chris were quiet, the usual banter replaced by a tense silence. I could feel the unease spreading through the car, but none of us wanted to admit it. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the outskirts of Silent Hill. The town itself was shrouded in the same thick fog, making it look like a ghostly relic from another time. The buildings were old and decaying, with boarded-up windows and peeling paint. Not a single light was on, and there were no signs of life. It was as if the town had been abandoned overnight, left to rot and fade away. "Let's just get through this place," Jenna muttered from the back seat, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Something about the town felt wrong, like we had stumbled into a place where we didn't belong. As I drove down the main street, the tires crunching on the cracked pavement, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking in the fog behind us. That's when we heard it, the first sound we'd heard since entering Silent Hill. It was faint at first, a soft, distant whisper carried on the wind. But as we continued down the street, it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't a voice but a chorus of them, all speaking in unison. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning. "What the hell is that?" Mark asked, his voice tight with fear. None of us answered. I pressed down on the gas, wanting nothing more than to get out of that town, but the car seemed to resist, like the fog was thickening, dragging us down into its depths. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from all around us, closing in. My hands were slick with sweat, and I could feel my pulse quicken, a cold dread settling in my stomach. We needed to get out, now. Suddenly the car lurched, and the engine sputtered, then died. We coasted to a stop in the middle of the road, the headlights dimming until we were plunged into near darkness. "No, no, no," I muttered, frantically turning the key in the ignition, but the engine refused to start. "Come on." "Is this some kind of joke?" Chris asked, his voice shaking. "This isn't funny, man." "It's not a joke," I snapped, slamming my hand on the steering wheel in frustration. Jenna leaned forward, her eyes wide with fear. "What do we do now?" Before I could answer, the whispering stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press down on us. The fog outside thickened until we could barely see the outlines of the buildings. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave the car, to run as fast as I could, but something held me back. Then we saw it. Out of the fog emerged a figure, walking slowly down the center of the road toward us. It was impossible to tell who or what it was. The fog distorted its shape, making it appear almost inhuman. It moved with an unnatural grace, its steps silent on the cracked pavement. "Lock the doors," Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't need to be told twice. I reached over and hit the lock button, the click of the doors sounding unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. The figure continued to approach, its outline growing clearer with each step. It was tall and thin, its limbs long and unnaturally angled. Its head was bowed, obscuring its face. The whispers started again, louder this time, filling the car with their insistent drone. They weren't coming from outside, though. They were inside, surrounding us, invading our minds. "Make it stop," Jenna whimpered, covering her ears. But there was no escaping it. The whispers grew louder and louder until they were all I could hear, drowning out the sound of my own thoughts. The figure was right in front of the car now, its hand reaching out toward the windshield. Its fingers were long and thin, like twisted branches, and as they touched the glass, the whispers stopped. For a brief, terrible moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the figure slowly raised its head, revealing a face that was almost human but not quite. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were dark, empty voids. It smiled, a grotesque, unnatural grin that sent a shiver down my spine. And then it spoke, its voice a raspy whisper that cut through the silence like a knife. "You shouldn't be here." The words hung in the air, heavy with a malice that made my skin crawl. The figure's smile widened, and I could see rows of sharp pointed teeth behind its lips. It leaned closer, its face pressing against the glass, and I could feel its cold breath on my skin, even through the windshield. Without thinking, I slammed the car into reverse, my foot hitting the gas pedal hard. The tires screeched as we shot backward, the figure disappearing into the fog. I didn't stop to see if it was following us. I just kept driving, the car lurching as I desperately tried to get us out of that cursed town. The whispers started up again, louder this time, filling the car with their maddening drone. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel their intent. They wanted us to stay, to become part of the town, to never leave. But I wasn't about to let that happen. I forced myself to focus, to push through the fear, and to keep driving. The fog seemed to cling to the car, trying to drag us back, but I kept my foot on the gas, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we broke through the fog and emerged back onto the main highway. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road, but I didn't care. I was just glad to be out of that town. None of us spoke as we drove away, the whispers fading into the distance. It wasn't until we were miles away, the town far behind us, that I finally let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. We never talked about what happened in Silent Hill, not even to each other. It was as if we'd all silently agreed to pretend it never happened. But I know the truth. That place isn't just abandoned, it's alive, a malevolent force that preys on those who stumble into its grasp. And it doesn't let go. Even now, I can still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night when I'm alone. They're faint, barely audible, but they're there, a reminder that Silent Hill is still out there, waiting for someone else to take that shortcut. I've always lived in the same house, a modest 2-story place at the edge of a small town. My parents bought it when I was a kid, and it's the only home I've ever known. The neighborhood is quiet, filled with older couples and young families, but what sets it apart is the dense forest that borders our backyard. The woods have always been a source of mystery and adventure for me. As a child, I'd spend hours exploring them, imagining all sorts of fantastical creatures hiding just out of sight. But as I got older, I started to feel differently about the woods. It wasn't that I was scared of them exactly, but there was something about them that made me uneasy. It was as if they were watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal their secrets. It all started last winter. The days were short, and the nights seemed to stretch on forever. One evening, after a long day at work, I was sitting in the living room, staring out the window at the snow-covered backyard. The woods loomed just beyond the fence, their dark silhouettes stark against the white landscape. I was about to get up and close the curtains when I noticed something odd. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees or an animal moving through the underbrush. But as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't a shadow. It was a figure, standing just at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't make out any details, but it was a person. They were just standing there, motionless, facing the house. I watched for a few moments, expecting them to move, to do something, but they didn't. They just stood there, as still as the trees around them. A shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly pulled the curtains shut. I told myself it was probably just some kid from the neighborhood playing a prank, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was something off about the whole thing. Something that made me feel like I was being watched. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see the figure again, but the backyard was empty. The snow had fallen overnight, covering any tracks that might have been left behind. That evening, as the sun began to set, I found myself drawn to the window again. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. I pulled back the curtains just enough to peek outside, and my heart nearly stopped. The figure was back, standing in the same spot as before, but this time I could see more of it. It was tall, with broad shoulders and long, spindly limbs. Its skin was pale, almost white, and it wore what looked like tattered clothing, barely covering its gaunt frame. But the worst part was its face, or rather, the lack of one. There was no mouth, no nose, no eyes, just a smooth, featureless surface, like a blank canvas. I stumbled back from the window, my pulse quickening. Who, or what, was this thing? And why was it watching me? I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, set my nerves on edge. I kept imagining that figure standing outside my window, its faceless head turned toward me, waiting. The next morning I tried to convince myself that it had all been a bad dream, a figment of my imagination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I hadn't imagined it, it was real. I decided to take action. I grabbed my coat and boots and headed outside, determined to find some evidence, some sign that I wasn't going crazy. The snow crunched under my feet as I made my way to the edge of the woods. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with snow. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped into the forest. The air was cold and still, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots on the snow. I walked deeper into the woods, searching for any trace of the figure I'd seen. But there was nothing, no footprints, no broken branches, nothing to indicate that anyone had been there. I was about to turn back when I noticed something strange. A few feet ahead, half buried in the snow, was a small, round object. I bent down to pick it up, brushing off the snow to reveal what looked like a small, handmade doll. It was crudely stitched together, with button eyes and a stitched mouth, its body made from old, worn fabric. There was something disturbingly familiar about it, something that made my skin crawl. I dropped the doll and took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't know what it was or where it had come from, but I knew I had to get out of there. As I turned to leave, I heard a noise, a soft shuffling sound, like something moving through the snow behind me. I froze, my pulse quickening, and slowly turned around. The figure was standing there, just a few feet away, its blank face turned toward me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in its gaze. The figure took a step toward me, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. It reached out one long bony arm, its fingers stretching toward me. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if listening to something only it could hear. Then, without a sound, it turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. I stood there, rooted to the spot, for what felt like an eternity, before I finally found the strength to move. I turned and ran, stumbling through the snow, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I was back in my yard, slamming the gate shut behind me. I never went back into the woods after that. I kept the curtains closed, avoiding the windows at night, and tried to convince myself that it was all just some strange, twisted hallucination. But I knew the truth. The figure was real, and it was still out there, watching, waiting. Sometimes late at night, I think I hear it. Soft footsteps in the snow, the creak of a branch, a whisper on the wind. I don't know what it wants or why it chose me, but I can feel its presence, lurking just beyond the edge of the woods. And I know, deep down, that it's only a matter of time before it comes back. I've worked the late shift at the convenience store for about 2 years now. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills and gives me time during the day to focus on my online classes. The store is in a quiet part of town, tucked between an old laundromat and a shuttered pizza place. At night, it's usually dead, just the occasional regular stopping by for a pack of cigarettes or a six-pack. On most nights, I'd kill time by scrolling through my phone, reading, or sometimes even doing homework when the store was completely empty. The monotony of the job was usually broken only by the buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead, or the distant hum of a passing car. But last Thursday night was different. It started like any other shift, with me behind the counter flipping through my phone while the clock ticked toward midnight. Around 11:30, a customer came in, a tall man with a hood pulled up over his head. He kept his face down as he walked through the aisles, so I didn't get a good look at him, but something about him made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way he moved, too quickly and quietly, or maybe it was just the lateness of the hour. He grabbed a few items, chips, a soda, a candy bar, and brought them to the counter. When he finally looked up, I saw his eyes. They were dark, too dark, like there was something behind them that didn't quite belong. He didn't say anything as he handed me the money, just stared at me, unblinking. I handed him his change, and he left without another word, but the feeling of unease lingered. I watched him through the front windows as he crossed the parking lot and disappeared into the night. I tried to shake it off, maybe he was just some tired guy on his way home from work. But something about the encounter stuck with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. The rest of the shift was uneventful, and I was starting to convince myself that I'd overreacted when, around 1:000 a.m., the power suddenly went out. The store was plunged into darkness, and the only light came from the street lamp outside, casting eerie shadows through the windows. I cursed under my breath, and grabbed the flashlight from under the counter. Power outages weren't common, but they happened occasionally, especially during storms. But that night the weather was calm, no rain, no wind, nothing to explain the sudden blackout. I flicked on the flashlight and made my way to the back of the store, where the circuit breakers were. As I passed by the aisles, the beam of light caught on the rows of shelves, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread as I reached the back room. The circuit breakers were all in the off position, which was strange. I flipped them back on, one by one, and the lights flickered back to life. Relief washed over me as the familiar hum of the overhead lights returned, but it was short-lived. When I stepped back into the store, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The front door was wide open. I knew I'd locked it after the last customer left. I always did. My eyes darted around the store, scanning the aisles for any sign of movement. The place was empty, or at least it looked that way. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I walked to the door and shut it, locking it again with trembling hands. I told myself it was just a fluke, that maybe I hadn't closed it all the way. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I returned to the counter, trying to focus on anything other than the gnawing fear that was starting to take hold. I busied myself with restocking the cigarettes, counting them out, and lining them up in neat rows, anything to keep my mind occupied. Then I heard it, a soft rustling sound, like someone moving through the aisles. I froze, straining to listen, but the noise stopped as soon as it started. I slowly turned, shining the flashlight toward the back of the store. Nothing. Just rows of shelves and products, everything in its place. But I knew I wasn't imagining it. Someone was in the store with me. I grabbed the phone from under the counter, ready to call the police, but when I brought it to my ear, there was nothing but static. I checked the line, unplugged it and plugged it back in, but it was dead. Panic began to creep in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to get out, to find a way to safety. I grabbed my keys and slowly made my way to the front door, flashlight in one hand, the other gripping the keys so tightly they dug into my palm. As I reached the door, something caught my eye, a shadow at the far end of the store, just beyond the reach of the overhead lights. It was tall, too tall to be a person, and it was moving, slowly but deliberately, toward me. I fumbled with the keys, trying to unlock the door, but my hands were shaking too much. The shadow was getting closer, its form becoming more distinct. It wasn't human, that much was clear. It was taller, with limbs that were too long and a body that seemed to shift and ripple in the dim light. Finally I managed to get the door open, and I bolted out into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, parked at the far end of the lot. I threw myself inside, locking the doors and starting the engine with shaking hands. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadow following me. But the parking lot was empty, the store bathed in the eerie glow of the street lamp. I didn't go back to work after that night. I called my manager the next morning and told her I was quitting. I didn't give a reason. Just that I couldn't work there anymore. She didn't ask for details, and I didn't offer any. I never found out what that thing was, or why it had appeared that night. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to stick around to find out. Whatever it was, it had been waiting, lurking in the shadows, watching me. And I wasn't about to give it another chance to catch me off guard. To this day, I avoid that part of town. I don't drive by the store, and I certainly don't go inside. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the shadow, about the way it moved, the way it seemed to be searching for something, or someone. My name is Claire Wilson, and I live at 32 Elm Street in a town that's small enough to go unnoticed on most maps. It's the kind of place where everyone knows each other, where secrets are supposed to stay buried. But there's something about this house, this street, that keeps secrets alive in the worst way possible. I moved into this house a few months ago. It was a fresh start, a way to leave behind a painful breakup, and the suffocating memories that clung to me in the city. I'd always been drawn to older houses, and this one had a charm that was hard to resist: tall windows, a wraparound porch, and a sprawling backyard that led into a thick wooded area. It felt like the perfect place to start over. The first few weeks were blissful. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, but I chalked it up to the isolation. I spent my days unpacking, decorating, and getting to know the local shops and the few friendly faces in the town. It felt like I was finally finding some peace. But then, the noises started. It began with soft creaks and groans in the middle of the night, nothing too alarming at first. Houses settle, wood expands and contracts, that's what I told myself. But then, I started hearing footsteps. They were light and deliberate, moving from room to room as if someone was pacing the halls while I slept. I would wake up, frozen in my bed, listening intently. But the moment I got up to investigate, the sounds would stop, leaving nothing but the oppressive silence of the night. I checked every room, every closet, every corner, but I never found anything out of place. The doors were always locked, the windows shut tight. I was alone, or at least I was supposed to be. As the days passed, the footsteps became more frequent, more insistent. They started happening during the day too, echoing through the house while I was cooking, reading, or working on my laptop. No matter where I was, I could hear them, just a few feet behind me, as if someone was following me. I started avoiding the house during the day, spending more time in town, at the cafe, or aimlessly driving through the countryside. But the dread followed me wherever I went, a nagging feeling that something was wrong, that something was waiting for me back at Elm Street. Then came the dreams. They started like any other dream, disjointed, surreal, but harmless. But they quickly turned darker. I began seeing the house in my dreams, but it wasn't my house, not really. It was older and decayed, with walls that seemed to breathe and shadows that stretched and twisted in unnatural ways. In these dreams I was always walking through the house, following the sound of those footsteps. They would lead me through dark hallways, past rooms filled with strange, unidentifiable objects, and down into the basement, a place I'd never been in real life, a place I didn't even know existed. The basement in my dreams was vast, far bigger than it should have been, with walls lined with shelves filled with old dusty books and jars of things I couldn't bear to look at too closely. In the center of the room was a large wooden door, ancient and foreboding, with a strange symbol carved into it. Every time I approached the door, I would wake up, drenched in sweat, my hands gripping the sheets. The dream was always the same, always ending just before I could open the door. One night, after a particularly vivid version of the dream, I woke up to find that the footsteps were no longer confined to my dreams. They were in the house, right above my head, in the attic. I didn't even know the house had an attic. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the slow, deliberate footsteps as they moved back and forth. I tried to ignore them, tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew I couldn't keep lying to myself. Something was in this house, something that had been here long before I arrived. The next morning, I found the entrance to the attic, hidden behind a panel in the hallway ceiling. The ladder was old and rickety, and it took all my willpower to climb it. The attic was dark, filled with boxes of old belongings, covered furniture, and thick layers of dust. But nothing seemed out of the ordinary. As I was about to leave, something caught my eye. A small, dusty book lying on the floor, half buried under a pile of old clothes. It looked ancient, the cover worn and faded, with the same strange symbol I'd seen in my dreams carved into the leather. I hesitated, then picked it up, my hands trembling. The pages were filled with strange, indecipherable writing, symbols and diagrams that made my head spin just looking at them. But one page stood out, an illustration of the house, my house, with a detailed map of the rooms and the basement. And there, at the center of the basement, was the door from my dreams. I dropped the book, my mind reeling. I had to get out of the house, had to leave, and never come back. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, a low, guttural voice, whispering my name. It was coming from the shadows, from the dark corners of the attic. I ran down the ladder, slamming the panel shut behind me. I didn't stop to pack, didn't even grab my keys. I just ran out of the house and kept running until I reached the edge of town. I didn't stop until I was in the next county, shaking and gasping for air. I stayed at a motel that night, and the next morning, I went to the local library, desperate for answers. I found an old newspaper article about the house on Elm Street, dated back over 100 years. It talked about a series of strange occurrences, disappearances and deaths, all centered around the house. The last owner had reportedly gone mad, raving about voices in the walls, and a door that shouldn't be opened. I never went back to Elm Street. I left town the next day, moved to a different state, changed my phone number, and tried to start over again. But the dreams followed me, the footsteps and the whispers never far behind. I've been living in fear ever since, always looking over my shoulder, always waiting for the day when the past will catch up with me. I know it's only a matter of time before it finds me, before the door opens, and whatever is behind it comes through. If you're reading this, stay away from 32 Elm Street. Some doors are better left closed. My name is Lucas Mitchell, and I live in a small town in Oregon, nestled between thick forests and winding roads. Life here is peaceful, the kind of peace that can almost lull you into forgetting the dangers that lurk just beyond the trees. This story is about one such danger, something I never thought I'd encounter in my lifetime. It started with a rumor, a whisper among the townsfolk about something strange in the woods. They called it the Thing. No one knew what it was, and most people dismissed it as nothing more than a ghost story, a way to keep kids from wandering too far into the forest. But as the days passed, more and more people began to talk about it. One Friday evening I decided to take a walk through the woods. I'm not sure what compelled me to do it. Maybe it was the need to clear my head after a long week of work, or maybe it was the quiet allure of the forest at dusk. The air was cool, and the light was fading fast, casting long shadows across the ground. The trees towered above me, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. It was peaceful, almost serene. But as I walked deeper into the woods, that peace began to feel wrong. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed down on me like a weight. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I saw no sign of anyone or anything around me. I tried to brush off the feeling, chalking it up to the growing darkness and my overactive imagination. But then I heard it, a low guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was close, too close. My blood ran cold as I realized the sound was coming from directly behind me. I spun around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The shadows played tricks on my eyes, but I saw nothing. For a moment I thought I might have imagined it, but then I heard it again, this time louder, more menacing. Panic began to set in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a wolf, though the sound didn't quite match either. I slowly backed away, keeping my eyes on the spot where I thought the sound had come from. But as I moved, I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye, a figure, tall and gaunt, standing between the trees. It was human-like, but distorted, its limbs too long, its posture hunched. The thing didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its gaze locked on me. My stomach churned with dread as I realized this was no animal, this was something else entirely. I didn't wait to find out what it wanted. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the forest floor. The trees blurred past me as I sprinted toward the safety of the town, but the thing gave chase. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining ground with terrifying speed. Every instinct in me screamed to run faster to get away, but the thing was relentless. I could feel its presence closing in, a cold dread washing over me. Just as I thought I wouldn't make it, the lights of the town came into view. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning as I finally broke free of the trees and into the open. I stumbled into the street, nearly collapsing from exhaustion. The thing didn't follow me out of the woods, but I knew it was still there, watching from the shadows. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my home, slamming the door behind me and locking every window. For hours, I sat in my living room, waiting for the thing to show up. But it never did. The night passed in silence, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. When morning came, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if the daylight had somehow banished the terror of the previous night. But the fear never really left me. I knew what I saw, and I knew it was still out there, lurking in the woods. The thing that no one believed in. The horror that was too real to ignore. I've never gone back into those woods, and I've warned everyone I know to stay away. Some listen, some don't. But I can't forget what I saw, and I can't shake the feeling that one day, the thing will come out of the shadows again, looking for me. And this time, I might not be so lucky. My name is Alex Turner, and I work as a night security guard at an office building downtown. The job isn't glamorous, but it's quiet, and it pays the bills. I've always preferred the solitude of the night shift, no demanding coworkers, no chaotic meetings, just me and the empty halls. But after what happened last month, I'm not so sure I want the quiet anymore. The building I work in is old, a relic from the 1970s, with flickering fluorescent lights and long, echoing corridors. At night, the place feels like a tomb, silent and still, with only the hum of the air conditioning to break the monotony. My job was simple: make rounds every couple of hours, check the security cameras, and lock up before heading home. It was a Thursday night when things took a turn. The evening started like any other. I arrived at the building around 10 p.m., grabbed a coffee from the break room, and settled into the security office. The cameras showed nothing unusual, just the empty cubicles and conference rooms bathed in the pale glow of emergency lights. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my coffee and scrolling through my phone to pass the time. Around midnight, I started my first round. The halls were as empty as ever. The only sound was the soft squeak of my shoes against the linoleum floor. I checked each door, making sure they were locked, then moved on to the next floor. Everything was routine until I reached the third floor. That's when I noticed something strange. The door to one of the conference rooms was ajar, just slightly. I knew I'd locked it earlier, but I chalked it up to my forgetfulness. I walked over, intending to close it, when I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. There was a light on inside, a dim flickering light that I couldn't quite place. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. The room was supposed to be empty, and no one else was supposed to be in the building. Cautiously I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty as I expected, but on the large conference table in the center of the room was an old, battered tape recorder, the source of the flickering light. It looked like something out of the 1980s, covered in dust and grime. I didn't remember seeing it there before, but then again, I didn't spend much time in this room. Curiosity got the better of me, and I reached out to press play. The recorder whirred to life, the tape crackling with static before a voice emerged, low and distorted. "Is anyone there?" the voice asked, a note of desperation in the tone. "Please, if you can hear me, you have to help." I felt a chill run down my spine. The voice was unfamiliar, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. I listened as the voice continued, describing a series of strange occurrences. A figure in the shadows, a sense of being watched, the feeling of something lurking just out of sight. The tape ended abruptly, cutting off with a sharp click. I stood there for a moment, processing what I'd heard. It was probably just a prank, I told myself, Something left behind by a bored employee. Still, the voice lingered in my mind, the urgency and fear it conveyed. I decided to leave the tape recorder where it was and continue my rounds. As I walked through the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The halls seemed darker, the shadows deeper, and every little sound made me jump. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. When I returned to the security office, I checked the cameras again. That's when I saw it. On the monitor for the third floor, in the same conference room where I'd found the tape recorder, was a figure. It was standing by the table, its back to the camera, shrouded in darkness. I couldn't make out any details, but it was a person, or at least, it looked like one. My first thought was that someone had broken in, but that didn't make sense. The building was secure, and I hadn't seen any signs of forced entry. Besides, who would break in just to stand in an empty conference room? I grabbed my flashlight and headed back to the third floor, my nerves on edge. When I reached the conference room, the door was closed again, but I could see the light from the tape recorder flickering underneath. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room was empty. No figure, no sign that anyone had been there. The tape recorder was still on the table, its light blinking steadily. I couldn't understand it. I'd seen someone on the camera, I was sure of it. But now, there was nothing. Feeling uneasy, I decided to check the other floors, just to be safe. As I walked, the building seemed to close in around me, the silence almost oppressive. Every creak and groan of the old structure made my skin crawl. I kept telling myself it was just the building settling, and that there was nothing to worry about. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. When I returned to the security office, I checked the cameras again. The figure was back, standing in the same spot as before. But this time, it was facing the camera. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I stared at the monitor. The figure had no face, just a blank, featureless void where a face should be. It was like a mannequin, lifeless and unsettling. I watched in horror as the figure began to move, slowly, deliberately, as if it knew I was watching. It turned and walked toward the door, disappearing from the camera's view. My heart skipped a beat as I realized it was coming for me. I bolted out of the security office, not caring about protocol or the fact that I was abandoning my post. I just knew I had to get out of there. As I ran down the hall, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, slow, heavy, echoing off the walls. I didn't dare look back. I reached the stairwell and practically flew down the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I burst out of the building and into the cool night air, my mind racing. I fumbled with my keys, desperate to get to my car. When I finally managed to unlock the door, I jumped inside and started the engine. I didn't look back as I sped away. My only thought was to get as far from that place as possible. I quit the next day. I didn't bother explaining why. I didn't think anyone would believe me anyway. But I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. I don't know what I saw that night, or what was on that tape, but I do know one thing: something was in that building with me, and it was watching, waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear those same slow, heavy footsteps outside my apartment door. And every time I pray that whatever it was, it stays far, far away. My name is Kevin Rhodes, and I'm a long-haul trucker. I've been driving for nearly 20 years, crisscrossing the country from coast to coast. I've seen all kinds of things on the road, some beautiful, some bizarre, and some downright terrifying. But nothing compares to what happened to me on Highway 12 in the middle of the night last winter. It was a cold December evening, and I was hauling a load of electronics from Denver to Salt Lake City. The route was familiar, one I'd driven many times before. The stretch of Highway 12 I was on was isolated, a two-lane road winding through dense forests and rolling hills. There wasn't much out there, just miles and miles of dark highway, with the occasional flicker of headlights from a distant car. The weather had been clear when I left Denver, but as the night wore on, a thick fog began to roll in, blanketing the road in a suffocating gray. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and I had to slow down, creeping along at barely miles an hour. The fog was so dense it felt like I was driving through a wall, with the world beyond my headlights disappearing into an impenetrable void. I'd been driving for hours, and fatigue was starting to set in. My eyes felt heavy, and I knew I needed to find a place to pull over and rest. But on this stretch of Highway 12, there weren't many options. I decided to keep going, hoping to find a rest stop or a gas station where I could grab a cup of coffee and take a break. As I drove, I noticed a figure on the side of the road, barely visible through the fog. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a tree or a sign obscured by the mist. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person, standing alone on the shoulder, waving their arms frantically. Instinctively, I slowed down. It was unusual to see anyone out here, especially in the middle of the night, and I couldn't just leave them stranded. I pulled over to the side of the road, my truck's headlights cutting through the fog and illuminating the figure. It was a man, dressed in a long coat and hat, his face partially obscured by the shadows. I rolled down my window, calling out to him. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need a ride?" The man didn't answer right away. He just stood there staring at me, his face hidden in the darkness. Something about the way he stood there, motionless and silent, made me uneasy. But I pushed the feeling aside. Maybe he was just scared or in shock. "Are you lost?" I asked, trying again to get a response. Finally, the man nodded, slowly, almost imperceptibly. He took a step closer to the truck, and I could see him more clearly now. His clothes were old and worn, his coat tattered and frayed at the edges. His eyes, though, were what really caught my attention. They were wide and unblinking, with a strange hollow look to them. I hesitated. Something about this didn't feel right, but I couldn't just leave him out here in the middle of nowhere. Reluctantly, I leaned over and unlocked the passenger door. "Get in," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man didn't move at first, just continued to stare at me with those unsettling eyes. Then, without a word, he opened the door and climbed into the cab. He settled into the seat, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was struggling to control his own body. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye as I started driving again. He was sitting stiffly, his hands clenched in his lap, staring straight ahead. The silence between us was thick and uncomfortable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. After a few minutes, I tried to break the tension. "So, where are you headed?" The man didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that I'd spoken. He just kept staring straight ahead, his face blank and expressionless. I tried again, this time a little louder. "Do you have a destination, a town or something?" Still nothing. The only sound in the cab was the rumble of the engine and the faint whistle of the wind outside. The man's silence was starting to get to me, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. I thought about pulling over and telling him to get out, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Maybe he was in shock, or maybe he had some kind of mental issue. Either way, I didn't feel right just abandoning him out here. So I kept driving, trying to focus on the road and ignore the unsettling presence beside me. The fog was still thick, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of the truck. I kept my eyes on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching me, even though he hadn't turned his head once since getting in. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the fog and the darkness get to me. After what felt like an eternity, the fog began to lift, revealing the road ahead. I was relieved to see the outline of a gas station in the distance, a small oasis of light in the darkness. I decided to pull in, hoping to get some answers from my silent passenger. I pulled up to the pump and cut the engine, turning to the man. "We're at a gas station. You need anything?" The man didn't respond. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't do anything. It was like he was frozen in place, a statue in the passenger seat. I reached out to touch his arm, hoping to snap him out of whatever trance he was in. But as soon as my hand made contact, he turned to me, his eyes locking onto mine. There was something in those eyes, something dark and cold that made my blood run cold. I pulled my hand back, suddenly terrified of this strange, silent man in my truck. I'll be right back," I stammered, fumbling with the door handle. I practically jumped out of the truck, my skin crawling with unease. As I walked toward the gas station, I kept glancing back at the truck, half expecting the man to get out and follow me. But he didn't move. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, his face as blank and emotionless as ever. I went inside and grabbed a cup of coffee, trying to steady my nerves. The clerk behind the counter gave me a strange look, probably wondering why I looked so shaken. I didn't say anything, just paid for the coffee and headed back outside. But when I got back to the truck, the passenger seat was empty. The man was gone. The door was still closed, and there were no footprints in the snow outside the truck. It was like he had just vanished into thin air. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty seat, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. There was no way he could have left without me noticing. But he was gone, and I was alone in the cold, silent night. I got back into the truck and slammed the door, suddenly desperate to get out of there. I started the engine and pulled out of the gas station, my eyes scanning the road for any sign of the man. But there was nothing. Just the dark highway stretching out before me. I drove for hours, my hands shaking on the wheel, until I finally reached the outskirts of Salt Lake City. I pulled into a rest stop and parked the truck, too exhausted to go any further. But even as I tried to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that the man was still out there somewhere, watching and waiting. I haven't driven down Highway 12 since that night. I don't know who or what that man was, but I do know one thing: I'm never picking up a hitchhiker again. My name is Jake Thornton, and I live in a small town called Pinewood, at 14 Willow Road. Pinewood is one of those quiet, seemingly idyllic towns where everyone knows each other, and nothing ever really happens. I grew up here, went to school here, and after a brief stint in the city, I returned to take care of my elderly mother. It was supposed to be temporary, just until she got back on her feet, but things didn't go as planned. Now it's just me in this old house, with memories and shadows that seem to grow darker every night. The house itself is a relic, passed down through generations. My mother used to tell me stories about it when I was a kid, how it had survived storms, wars, and everything in between. It was supposed to be a symbol of resilience, but over the past few months, I've started to see it differently. What I once thought of as a protective cocoon now feels more like a prison, one that's slowly closing in on me. It all started on a stormy night in late October. I remember it clearly because it was the first time I felt truly uneasy in my own home. The wind was howling outside, rattling the windows, and the rain was coming down in sheets. I was sitting in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV, trying to find something to distract myself. But nothing held my attention. That's when I noticed it, the sound of footsteps coming from the attic. At first I thought it was just the house settling. But the more I listened, the more certain I became that it wasn't the usual creaks and groans of an old house. These were deliberate, slow footsteps, as if someone was pacing back and forth. I froze, staring up at the ceiling. The attic had always given me the creeps, even as a kid. It was filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and God knows what else. I hadn't been up there in years. But now, I had no choice. I had to find out what was causing those footsteps. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way up the narrow staircase, each step creaking under my weight. The air grew colder as I approached the attic door, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Then, with a deep breath, I turned it and pushed the door open. The attic was just as I remembered, dark, dusty, and filled with the remnants of a bygone era. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing old trunks, covered furniture, and cobwebs that seemed to stretch endlessly. But there was nothing out of the ordinary, no sign of anything, or anyone, that could have made those footsteps. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my breath visible in the frigid air, waiting for something to happen. But the attic remained silent, the only sound being the rain pounding on the roof above. Eventually, I convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing, that it was just the wind playing tricks on me. I turned off the flashlight and made my way back downstairs, but the unease lingered. Over the next few days the footsteps continued, always at the same time, late at night, when the house was dark and quiet. Each time I would go up to the attic hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was making the noise, but I always found nothing. It was as if the footsteps only existed in the moments before I opened the door, vanishing as soon as I stepped inside. Then, the whispers began. At first they were faint, barely audible over the sound of the wind. I would hear them late at night, just as I was drifting off to sleep. A low murmuring voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I couldn't make out the words, but something was unsettling about the tone. Something that made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just my imagination, but the whispers grew louder with each passing night. They seemed to follow me from room to room, always just out of reach, as if someone or something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers had become a constant presence, a never-ending drone that was driving me to the brink of madness. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way up to the attic, determined to find the source of the noise and put an end to it once and for all. This time, when I opened the attic door, I was met with a cold gust of wind that nearly knocked me off my feet. The air was thick with the smell of dampness and decay, and I could feel an oppressive weight pressing down on me. The beam of my flashlight flickered, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. As I stepped inside, the whispers grew louder, filling the room with their insidious murmur. I swept the flashlight across the attic, my heart thudding in my chest, but there was nothing. Just the same old furniture and boxes, covered in dust and cobwebs. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. A shadow, darker than the rest, shifting in the far corner of the room. I turned the flashlight toward it, but the beam flickered and died, plunging the attic into darkness. I fumbled for the switch, my fingers trembling, but the light wouldn't come back on. And then, I felt it, a presence, cold and malevolent, standing right behind me. I could feel its breath on the back of my neck, and hear the low guttural whisper in my ear. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. At that moment I knew that whatever was in this house wasn't human. It was something ancient, something evil, and it had been waiting for me all along. I don't remember how I got out of the attic. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the middle of the living room, drenched in sweat, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The house was silent, the whispers gone, but the terror remained, etched into my mind like a scar. I've been trying to sell the house ever since, but no one wants to buy it. The locals say it's cursed, that there's something wrong with it, something that can't be explained. I don't tell them about the footsteps or the whispers. I don't need to. They already know. I've started staying in motels, avoiding the house as much as possible, but no matter where I go, I can still feel it watching me, following me. It's like a shadow, always just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. The darkness is closing in, and I'm running out of places to hide. If you're reading this, stay away from 14 Willow Road. Don't make the same mistake I did. Whatever is in that house, it's not done with me yet. My name is Sam Turner, and I work as a freelance graphic designer. I live alone in a small coastal town known for its historic charm and picturesque views. My home is located just a few miles from a rugged coastline, where the old lighthouse stands as a lonely sentinel over the darkened sea. The lighthouse, abandoned for years, has always intrigued me. Its weather-beaten exterior and broken windows speak of forgotten times and lost stories. Last month, during a particularly stormy weekend, I decided to explore the lighthouse. I had been researching local legends for a personal project, and the lighthouse seemed to be a perfect subject. The storm was fierce, with heavy rain and gusty winds, but I saw it as an opportunity to capture the lighthouse in a dramatic setting. I packed my camera gear, a flashlight, and a few snacks, and set out just as dusk began to settle. The road leading to the lighthouse was narrow and winding, overgrown with brambles and trees that seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers. As I drove, the rain pounded on my car roof, and the wind howled through the gaps in the windows. I felt an uneasy excitement, a sense of anticipation mingled with apprehension. When I arrived, the lighthouse stood tall and imposing against the backdrop of a darkened sky. The structure was a faded white with red accents, now weathered to a dull gray. The beacon at the top was a broken, rusted relic of its former self. I parked my car at a distance, not wanting to attract any unwanted attention, and made my way towards the lighthouse. The wind was relentless, and the rain stung my face as I approached the entrance. The large wooden door was slightly ajar, creaking ominously in the wind. I pushed it open and stepped inside, immediately greeted by the smell of dampness and decay. The interior was dimly lit by the flashes of lightning outside, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I began my exploration on the ground floor, taking photos of the deteriorated equipment and the scattered debris. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and every gust of wind seemed to carry with it strange, almost ghostly sounds. I tried to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine as I made my way up the spiral staircase to the second level. The staircase was narrow and winding, with rusted metal steps that clanked loudly as I climbed. The higher I went, the colder and more oppressive the air became. The wind howled through the broken windows, and the rain lashed against the walls with increasing intensity. When I reached the second floor, I found more abandoned machinery and old charts scattered about. The place looked as if it had been frozen in time. I continued up the staircase, my flashlight casting flickering beams of light onto the walls. The third level was more ominous, with old lenses and tarnished brass fittings strewn about. The large window on this floor provided a panoramic view of the storm-tossed sea below. The sight was both breathtaking and foreboding, the waves crashing violently against the rocks. As I prepared to take some photos, I heard something that made me freeze. It was a faint, rhythmic thumping sound, almost like a heartbeat. The sound was coming from above, from the very top of the lighthouse where the beacon used to be. My curiosity got the better of me, and despite the growing sense of dread, I decided to investigate. I climbed the final set of stairs to the top of the lighthouse. The wind howled even louder here, and the rain hammered against the broken windows with a deafening roar. The top floor was a small circular room with a high ceiling, once home to the massive rotating lens that had guided ships to safety. As I stepped into the room, the thumping sound grew louder and more distinct. It was as if something, or someone, was moving around up there. My flashlight flickered ominously, and the shadows seemed to dance around the room. I scanned the area with my camera, trying to capture the eerie atmosphere, when I saw it, a figure, barely discernible, moving in the shadows. The figure was tall and gaunt, with a featureless face and long dark robes that seemed to merge with the shadows. It stood still for a moment, as if observing me, before moving slowly towards the center of the room. The rhythmic thumping continued, now accompanied by a low, mournful wail that seemed to emanate from the very walls. I felt an intense chill as the temperature dropped suddenly. My breath formed clouds in the cold air, and the room seemed to close in around me. I tried to focus my camera on the figure, but it was like trying to capture smoke. The image was distorted, and the figure seemed to blur and shift, as if it was not entirely solid. Panic began to set in. I turned to leave, but the door to the staircase was blocked by a large rusted piece of machinery that hadn't been there before. The figure continued its slow, deliberate movements, its wail growing louder and more desperate. I tried to move the machinery, but it was too heavy and stubborn. Desperation clawed at me as I searched for another way out. The figure was now directly in front of me, its hollow eyes seeming to peer into my soul. The thumping sound was deafening, and the wail had become a full-blown scream. I stumbled backward, trying to keep my composure as the walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Finally, I spotted a small window that had been partially boarded up. It was barely large enough for me to squeeze through, but it was my only option. I pushed aside the rotting boards and forced my way through the window, scraping my skin as I went. I fell onto the roof of the lighthouse and scrambled down the exterior steps, slipping and sliding on the rain-slicked surfaces. The wind howled around me, and the storm seemed to reach a crescendo, as if nature itself was trying to keep me from escaping. When I reached the ground, I didn't stop to look back. I ran to my car, my clothes drenched and my hands trembling. As I sped away from the lighthouse, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The lighthouse loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette seeming to reach out after me. To this day, I avoid the old lighthouse. I still see it sometimes, towering over the landscape, a silent reminder of that night. The rhythmic thumping and mournful wail continue to haunt me, a chilling echo of the forgotten souls trapped within its walls. Every stormy night, I hear those sounds in my dreams, and I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed just a little longer. I've always had a thing for late-night adventures. My name is Eric Coleman, a 29-year-old photographer who thrives on capturing the eerie beauty of abandoned places. One cold autumn night, I found myself seeking a new subject for my photo collection. Little did I know, my quest would lead me to an abandoned train station, and an experience that would haunt me for years. The night was clear, with a full moon casting eerie shadows over the quiet streets of our small town. I had heard rumors about an old train station on the outskirts of town, one that had been closed for decades but was supposedly still accessible. I'd always been fascinated by places like this, so I decided to check it out. The train station was located several miles away from the nearest neighborhood, in an area that had long been reclaimed by nature. The only access was a narrow dirt road lined with overgrown weeds and tangled branches. As I drove, the dim headlights of my car cut through the darkness, and the occasional animal darting across the road only added to the sense of isolation. When I finally reached the station, I was struck by how it seemed to loom out of the darkness. The building was a relic from a bygone era, with its faded brick walls and sagging roof. The large clock tower, once a proud symbol of progress, was now a skeletal silhouette against the night sky. I parked my car a safe distance away, and grabbed my camera and flashlight. The front entrance was boarded up, but I found a side door that was slightly ajar. With a little effort, I managed to push it open and slipped inside. The interior of the station was exactly what I had hoped for, a vast echoing space filled with dust and decay. Old ticket counters, long abandoned, stood like silent sentinels. Posters from decades ago still clung to the walls, their colors faded and curling at the edges. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic and faintly unsettling. I started snapping photos, the flash illuminating the dark corners and casting strange shadows. The only sounds were the distant drip of water from a leaky ceiling, and the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards beneath my feet. As I wandered deeper into the building, I noticed that the once grand waiting room was now filled with debris and broken furniture. It was as if time had forgotten this place, leaving it to rot and decay. My flashlight beam flickered over a large ornate clock mounted on the wall. The hands had stopped at 11:59, a frozen moment in time that seemed to mock the passage of years. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a soft shuffling sound coming from the direction of the old platform. It was barely audible, but in the stillness of the station, it was unmistakable. I paused and turned off my flashlight, straining to listen. The noise persisted, growing louder and more distinct. It was as if someone, or something, was moving around on the platform. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I made my way cautiously through the debris-strewn corridors, my flashlight once again casting long shadows on the walls. The noise grew more rhythmic as I approached the platform, almost like the sound of footsteps, but oddly irregular, as if the person or thing was dragging something behind them. When I reached the platform, I was greeted by an unsettling sight. The area was littered with old train parts and rusty equipment, and a dim light flickered from one of the old lamps. But it was what was on the tracks that caught my attention. A rusty old train carriage, covered in grime and cobwebs, was standing on the tracks. It looked like it hadn't moved in decades. Its doors were slightly ajar, and the sound was definitely coming from inside. I approached slowly, my camera at the ready, and peered through the open door. The interior of the carriage was as decayed as the rest of the station, but there was something else, something that made my skin crawl. The seats were covered in dust, and the floor was littered with garbage. But what caught my eye was the old-fashioned conductor's uniform draped over one of the seats. It was pristine, almost as if it had been cleaned and maintained despite the overall state of the carriage. The shuffling noise grew louder, and I could now see movement inside the carriage. Shadows shifted and danced across the walls, and I could swear I saw shapes moving in the darkness. My flashlight flickered, and I had to squint to make out what was happening. The noise was now accompanied by a faint, high-pitched sound that resembled whispering. I stepped back, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but curiosity held me in place. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open further, preparing to take a few more pictures. As I did, I saw them, figures huddled in the shadows. They were gaunt, with hollow eyes and ragged clothing, their features barely discernible. They were sitting in the seats, as if waiting for a train that would never arrive. Their eyes seemed to follow me as I moved, their expressions a mix of desperation and despair. My breath caught in my throat as one of them slowly stood up. The figure moved toward the door with a shuffling gait, its eyes locked onto mine. I could see now that its face was gaunt and hollow, with an unsettling grin stretching across its features. I stumbled backward, my instincts finally overcoming my curiosity. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty station as I made my way back to the side door. The shadows seemed to close in around me, and the whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices urging me to stay. I burst out of the building and into the cold night air, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I reached my car, throwing open the door and starting the engine with shaking hands. As I sped away from the station, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The old train station loomed in the distance, its dark windows like eyes watching me leave. I never went back to that station. I don't even drive down that road anymore. The experience left me with a sense of dread that hasn't fully dissipated. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear those whispers again, calling to me from the depths of the forgotten train station. The memory of that night lingers, a chilling reminder of the things that hide in the shadows, waiting for someone foolish enough to seek them out. And every now and then, I wonder if I'll ever escape the whispers that follow me, or if they'll eventually catch up to me, dragging me back to that old abandoned train station. My name is Emily Foster, and I live in a quaint historic neighborhood in the suburbs of Boston. My house is a charming old Victorian, complete with a creaky wooden floor and ivy creeping up the walls. It was a dream come true when I moved in 2 years ago. The neighborhood was quiet, with friendly faces and manicured lawns. That is, until the house next door was sold. The house had been vacant for several years, but it recently caught the eye of a new buyer. When the sold sign went up, I remember feeling a mix of excitement and curiosity. It was a large, imposing building that had fallen into disrepair, but I was eager to meet the new neighbors and welcome them to the community. The new owner was a man named Victor. I only saw him briefly when he first moved in. He was tall, with dark hair and a stern expression that seemed out of place in our otherwise cheerful neighborhood. He didn't make much effort to socialize, which struck me as odd, but I assumed he was just busy settling into his new home. One evening about a month after Victor moved in, I was in my kitchen making dinner when I noticed something strange. My kitchen window faced his house, and I could see that the lights in his living room were on. The unusual part was that the lights flickered erratically as if someone was constantly flipping the switch on and off. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just an issue with his wiring or maybe a light bulb that was going out. Later that night, I heard a series of loud bangs coming from Victor's house. The noises were so jarring that they made me jump. I peered out the window, but the curtains were drawn tightly and I couldn't see anything through them. I went to bed, dismissing the noises as typical of an old house settling or perhaps a renovation project. Over the next few weeks, Victor's behavior became increasingly peculiar. I would occasionally see him pacing back and forth in front of the windows, or standing perfectly still in the dark, staring out into the night. When I tried to catch his eye to say hello, he would quickly look away and retreat inside. His lack of interaction, combined with the odd behavior, began to unsettle me. One rainy night, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood and see if I could learn more about Victor's activities. As I approached his house, I noticed something unusual. There were no lights on in the house, but the front door was slightly ajar. I hesitated, but something compelled me to move closer. I quietly approached the door and pushed it open just enough to peer inside. The interior was dark and silent, and I couldn't see much beyond the dim outline of furniture. But then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from somewhere deep within the house. It was irregular, like someone drumming their fingers on a table. Suddenly, I saw a shadow move across the room. My breath caught in my throat, and I quickly stepped back, closing the door as quietly as I could. I was shaken, but tried to convince myself that I had imagined it. Perhaps Victor was working on some project that involved unusual noises. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The following days were marked by more strange occurrences. I noticed that Victor had started placing old tattered curtains over his windows, obscuring any view into his home. The rhythmic tapping continued, more frequent and more pronounced each night. I began to feel a sense of dread every time I heard it. One evening, I saw Victor standing outside in the rain, staring up at the dark sky. His expression was unreadable, and he remained there for what felt like hours. I considered calling the police, but without any concrete evidence of wrongdoing, I decided against it. Then, one night, as I was lying in bed, I heard something that froze me in place. It was a loud, echoing scream, followed by a series of frantic knocks. My first thought was that someone was in danger, so I immediately called. The dispatcher assured me that an officer would be sent to investigate. When the police arrived, they knocked on Victor's door but received no response. After several attempts, they forced their way inside, and I watched from my window as they searched the house. They were in there for a long time, and when they finally emerged, they looked both puzzled and concerned. They told me that there was nothing unusual inside, no evidence of distress or illegal activity. Victor was not there, and his belongings appeared untouched. The police assured me that they would continue to investigate if any further issues arose, but I was left with more questions than answers. Over the next few days I tried to go about my routine, but the sense of unease lingered. I could still hear the rhythmic tapping every night, growing louder and more persistent. One night, while I was alone in my living room, I heard a loud crash coming from Victor's house. It was followed by a series of hurried footsteps and muffled voices. This time, I didn't hesitate. I called again and reported the noise. This time the response was quicker, and the police arrived within minutes. When they entered Victor's house, they found it empty once more. However, they discovered something that sent chills down my spine. In the basement, hidden behind a false wall, they found a series of old dusty journals and a collection of unsettling photographs. The journals were filled with disturbing entries about Victor's obsession with the concept of pure silence, and his attempts to achieve it by isolating himself from the world. The photographs depicted various scenes of his house in different stages of disrepair, with unsettling annotations about the voices he heard and the secrets he was uncovering. The police were baffled by the discoveries, and Victor remained missing, his whereabouts unknown. Since that night, the rhythmic tapping has ceased, and the house remains eerily silent. Victor's property was eventually put up for sale again, but no one has moved in. The house stands as a chilling reminder of the dark secrets it holds. I still occasionally hear strange noises coming from that direction, but I try to ignore them. The memory of those nights continues to haunt me, a stark reminder of the unknown dangers that can lie behind closed doors. When I was a kid, I spent my summers at my grandparents' cabin by Crystal Lake. The lake was nestled deep in the woods, far from any town or city, surrounded by towering pines and a sense of peaceful isolation. It was where time seemed to stand still, where the world's problems felt a million miles away. But one summer, everything changed, and the lake became a place I would never return to. I was 14 then, and it was the last summer before high school. I had always been a bit of a loner, so the isolation of the lake suited me just fine. My days were spent fishing, swimming, and exploring the dense woods that seemed to go on forever. But it was the nights that held a particular allure for me. There was something about the darkness out there, with no city lights to dull the stars, that made me feel both small and alive. One evening, I decided to take the old rowboat out onto the lake. The sun was just starting to set, casting a fiery orange glow across the water. I loved being out on the lake at dusk, watching the day slip away as the world grew quiet. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the water against the boat, and the distant calls of birds settling in for the night. I rowed out to the center of the lake, where the water was deep and still, and let the boat drift. As I sat there, the sky grew darker, and the first stars began to appear. I was lost in the tranquility of the moment when I noticed something odd. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, and a thick fog began to roll in from the far side of the lake. It wasn't uncommon for fog to form at night, but this was different, thicker, almost unnaturally so. I tried to dismiss it, chalking it up to the unpredictable nature of the lake, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The fog grew denser by the minute, wrapping around me until I could barely see the front of the boat. The air was heavy and cold, and a strange silence fell over the lake, as if the world had been muted. I decided it was time to head back to the cabin. I grabbed the oars and started rowing, but the boat barely moved. It was as if the water had turned to molasses, thick and resistant. I rowed harder, but no matter how much effort I put in, the boat seemed to stay in the same spot. Panic began to set in, but I refused to give in to it. I told myself that I just needed to keep calm and keep rowing. After what felt like an eternity, I finally began to make some progress. I could just make out the faint outline of the shoreline through the fog when I heard it, a soft splash, followed by a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down my spine. It came from behind me, out in the fog. I stopped rowing and listened, straining to hear over the pounding of my pulse in my ears. There it was again, a splash, closer this time. And then, something else, something that sounded like whispering. It was faint, almost drowned out by the water, but it was there. I whipped around, trying to see through the fog, but there was nothing. Just the endless gray of the mist and the dark water beneath me. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but the sound persisted, growing louder and more distinct. It wasn't the wind. It was voices, many of them, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. They seemed to be all around me, coming from the water, from the fog, from everywhere and nowhere at once. My hands were trembling as I grabbed the oars and rowed with everything I had. The whispers grew louder and more urgent, and I could feel something in the water, something moving just beneath the surface. The boat began to rock as if something was bumping against it, trying to tip it over. I was halfway to the shore when I felt a sudden violent tug on one of the oars. It was ripped from my hand and disappeared into the water. I grabbed the remaining oar and rowed harder, desperate to reach the shore. But the boat was moving slower now, as if something was holding it back. The whispers had turned into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, their tone rising in a strange, chilling harmony. I was almost at the shore when I felt another tug, this time on the boat itself. It jerked violently to the side, nearly capsizing. I leaned into the opposite direction, trying to keep it upright, when I saw them, hands, pale and bloated, reaching up from the water, grasping the sides of the boat. I screamed and tried to shake them off, but there were too many. They pulled at the boat, dragging it down, inch by inch, into the black water. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see the shore, but I wasn't going down without a fight. I stood up, using the remaining oar to beat at the hands, but it was useless. They kept coming, pulling the boat deeper and deeper. I was waist deep in the freezing water when I decided to make a run for it. I dove into the lake and swam as hard as I could toward the shore, the voices still echoing in my ear. The water was like ice, numbing my limbs, but I pushed on, refusing to look back. I could feel them behind me, those hands, reaching for me, trying to pull me under. Just when I thought I couldn't swim any further, my feet touched the bottom. I scrambled onto the shore, panting and shivering, and collapsed onto the ground. The fog was already starting to lift, and the whispers faded into the night. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring up at the sky, trying to comprehend what had just happened. When I finally found the strength to stand, I made my way back to the cabin. My grandparents were still asleep, oblivious to the terror I had just experienced. I never told them what happened. I never told anyone. But I never went back to the lake either. Even now, years later, the memory of that night lingers like a dark cloud over my mind. I've heard stories about Crystal Lake since then. Legends of drownings, of bodies that were never recovered, of spirits that still linger beneath the surface. I don't know if I believe in all that, but I do know one thing. Something is out there in that lake, something ancient and malevolent, waiting for its next victim. And I was lucky to escape it.